All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Isaiah Du, and I have the honor of um, presenting our speaker today. Her name is Karen Leung, and she is the Juris Vanger and Linda Christianson Endowed Faculty Fellow in Aeronautics and Astronautics. Her research focuses on building trustworthy autonomous systems that can operate seamlessly with, alongside, and around humans. Her work lies in the intersection of dynamics and control, robotics, machine learning, and control. Prior to joining the University of Washington, she was a research scientist with the Autonomous Vehicles Research Group at NVIDIA, where she currently holds a partial appointment. Karen received her Ph.D. and MS degree in Aeronautics and Astronautics from Stanford University. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So do I guess, do I start or is there?
Yes, please.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. It's great to see a full room. I'm really excited to be able to chat with you all and share, some of the research that I'm currently working on in my group at the University of Washington. But before I start, I wanted to, just give a brief overview on my journey to where I am right now, starting from my undergraduate journey, which I know many of you are also in your undergraduate degree program. So here's a bit of a timeline. So here's a picture. I think this is actually from my first or second week starting my degree. And here you see me on the right in these overalls where we were going to, basically a machine shop to learn about, all the different machine tools as part of my introduction to aerospace course. There I look really young and excited there. And then, anyway, so at the end of my second year, I was fortunate to be accepted to the summer research scholarship. Unfortunately, I didn't take a lot of photos back then, except this photo of my friend who also did this research scholarship with me, and you can see him taking an afternoon nap here. So in my second year, I had an opportunity to do some research experience. And then in my fourth year, this was a 5-year degree. In my fourth year, I was again fortunate enough to be accepted to a study abroad program. This was at the University of California in San Diego. This was my first time really living abroad for an extended period of time. And this was, I was really grateful and fortunate to get this experience. And then right after that, actually, I managed to secure another internship. Oh, not another internship, my first internship. And this time, this was as part of this program called IAESTE. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. This is basically an international technical exchange or technical internship exchange program. And there I got to spend 6 months in Zurich on a paid internship, and I was able to meet a lot of people from all around the world. And so that was a really fun time as well. And then what's next? Yeah, and then I came back, finished my 5th year of my undergraduate degree, and I was again fortunate enough to secure a research opportunity in the applied math department, and also got a small research award to support that. And then finally, I graduated here with first class honors, and which in Australia really meant I got an average of A, around like a grade of A during my degree, and I also did a research thesis then. So usually I wanted to give you some highlights on my undergraduate degree, and also note that I did not graduate top of my class or anything, but I still was able to continue into grad school and more research. And so just a really quick overview of what happened after I graduated. I was fortunate enough to do my master's in aerospace engineering at Stanford and also my PhD. But during my PhD, I did a couple of internships. The first one was at Toyota Research Institute, which was part of the who also funded part of my PhD research. And then also towards the end, an internship at NVIDIA. And I graduated. And then I spent a year at NVIDIA again, this time as a full-time research scientist. And then now I'm an assistant professor at the University of Washington. Okay, so that's a little bit about me. But today I want to talk more about my research on trustworthy autonomous systems that can safely and fluently interact with, around, and alongside humans. And I want to say that we're in a really, really exciting time right now, because we're seeing more and more places where we have autonomous systems that are now interacting with humans in various real-world settings. And so obviously we have today already, we see autonomous vehicles sharing the road with other human users, whether this be cyclists, pedestrians, or other drivers on the road. We're also seeing situations where we have these mobile ground vehicles operating around humans. We see this happening inside warehouses, or also more and more in the home, as you can see on the right. We also see autonomy playing a role in assistive devices. And so we also have kind of components of, we have some semi-autonomous wheelchairs or in other assistive devices. We also see this in uncrewed aerial vehicles in, say, search and rescue operations. And so these vehicles must operate closely around humans. And also in many cases, they are controlled by humans. And here are some photos taken at the Snohomish County Search and Rescue. And they're showing off some of the UAVs that they use as part of their search and rescue operations. And then we also see a lot of cases, there's been a lot of discussion in taking autonomous systems beyond Earth, right, out into space in these really, really remote environments with limited human resources. And so hopefully, you agree that we're seeing more and more cases where autonomy is going to be playing a huge role in our day-to-day lives, whether this is on Earth, in the sky, or in space. And to that, the kind of research vision of my lab is to build trustworthy autonomous systems that can operate seamlessly with, alongside, and around humans. Okay, so with, alongside, and around. And so I won't have time to go through all of them, all the research topics in kind of these three areas, but I'm really going to be focusing on the third one, the working around humans. And so this is referring to cases where an autonomous system, so say a ground vehicle here, needs to navigate around people. And so this picture that you see is actually taken right on the University of Washington campus, kind of right in the middle where it's really, really busy with lots of people walking to and from their classes. But even in this setting, there are already a lot of research challenges that prop up. The first is human behavior prediction, right? Because there are a lot of humans walking around. It is really important for an autonomous system to be able to predict or anticipate how humans are going to behave. And then with this behavior prediction, this can inform what the robot does. And it needs to understand how humans may respond or interact with their own motions. And so there's a notion of, this is research direction of interaction-aware planning. And then there's also the question of safety, right? So at the end of the day, how do we ensure that the autonomous system is operating safely and it is taking controls that will prevent a collision in the future? Right? So there's a lot of control theory that comes into play. And then on top of all that, we also need to think about what should the robot be doing? What is the task that it needs to do? And how does it know, how does it know, how does it, reason about the world and figure out what is the task that it needs to do? So there's this question of task specification. And then there's also the question of context, and trying to understand in these real world settings, there's a lot of contextual cues or features that it needs to account for, and how do we leverage that information to improve learning in terms of planning and control and prediction. And so here I've just highlighted a few challenges in this problem of navigation. And of course, I won't have time to go through all of these. And so today I really just want to focus on these two elements, or these two components: safe control and interaction-aware planning. Okay. By the way, I don't see a picture of everyone when I'm presenting on full screen. So if there's a question, please feel free to interrupt. Okay. So the theme of today's talk, I'll be focusing on on interaction-aware planning and safe control, but kind of central to those two themes, I want to talk about this idea of going from a task-centric to a human-centric autonomy. And so what this means is that rather than treating humans as a nuisance or an adversary, we want to start treating humans as partners and see how by changing this perspective, we can create more safer and more fluent human-robot interactions. So I'm going to be talking about two things, and we'll see how we go on time. But the first part of my talk will be on safe control. And so we're trying to answer the question, how close is too close before evasive action is taken? And then the second one is on interaction-aware planning. And the question I'm going to be focusing on is how to make interactions natural and seamless without explicit communication. And I'll talk, and I'll kind of explain more what that means in a bit. So to the first question, the first part of my talk. So I want to, kind of ask you this question: to brake or not to brake, right? So on the left, we see that there are two cars. One is autonomous and the other one is a human driven. And they're kind of approaching this merge intersection. And as the control engineer for the autonomous car, should you make sure that the autonomous car here brake in this particular situation? Okay, so this is actually a trick question, and I'm going to give the very unsatisfying answer and say that it depends, right? It depends on what constitutes as reasonable behavior, right? It really depends on what the blue car predicts what the red car is going to do. So, for example, if we assume that the red car can do anything possible in the future, and then we see that this future of the red car intersects with what the blue car could also possibly do in the future, and that's what you see on the left, then the answer is it is unsafe, and therefore the blue car should brake. Alternatively, if you made a different set of assumptions, say assume that both cars brake or both cars will take evasive maneuvers, then maybe the answer is to not brake, and that the cars should continue moving forward as they are. And so really your answer depends on what you constitute as reasonable behavior for the other car. Unfortunately, different stakeholders make different assumptions. So different regulatory bodies, different industries, and even in academia have make different assumptions, and therefore they lead to different safe control strategies. Just to kind of give you a taste of what I mean by different, here are just some references showing all the different types of safe control strategies that people have come up with. And maybe you have seen some of these terms before. So we have something known as velocity obstacles, contingency planning, In NVIDIA, there's this concept of safety force field, whereas in Mobileye, which is another autonomous driving company, they use this term called responsibility sensitive safety. There's another thing called forward reachable sets and another thing called Hamilton-Jacobi reachability, which I'll talk a little bit more in this talk. Okay, so there's many different ways to ensure safety for your autonomous vehicles. Which one should we use? So before we answer that question, I want to introduce a terminology. And this is something I completely made up, but it's just really nice to have some terminology to help us reason about safety. And so this term is called safety concept. And what that is basically two functions. And these are two functions mapped from world state, so some description of the world or the environment. And this should give us two things. The first is a measure of safety. So this should tell us, well, they should spit out a number that tell us how safe or unsafe the situation is. And then it should also tell us a set of allowable safe controls that your autonomous agent should be allowed to take to maintain safety, to maintain safety for itself. And so, just to summarize, a safety concept should give us two things. One, a safety measure or a measure of safety, and two, a set of allowable safe controls. And so now that we have this notion of a safety concept, I want to talk about Hamilton-Jacobi reachability, which maybe you have seen before. But just in a nutshell, this Hamilton-Jacobi reachability, or HJ reachability, is basically a mathematical framework or a mathematical formulation that allows us to capture these closed loop interactions between a human and a robot, right? So, and this is achieved through optimal control theory. And so what we have here is on the right, a partial differential equation. And what we have here is that the solution to this equation, V, is precisely the measure of safety that I just talked about in the safety concept definition. And then inside this partial differential equation, we are reasoning about how a human and a robot will interact with each other. And to be robust, to be on the safe side or the conservative side, we assume that the human is seeking collision and that the robot is avoiding collision. So basically, the robot is assuming the worst thing possible, assuming that the human will do the worst thing possible to cause a collision, and the robot is doing the best thing it can to avoid a collision. And if the answer is they still collide, then it's saying that there was actually nothing that the robot could do to avoid a collision. Anyway, so without getting into too much details, if we solve this partial differential equation, then we get the solution V, which tells us how safe or unsafe your robot is. But it turns out that through this HJ reachability framework, we can actually recover many different types of safety concepts, all the way from forward reachable sets, which was one of the boxes that I showed you before. We can also come up with safety concepts that assume cars only brake. And so this is recovering the safety force field concept and the responsibility sensitive safety concept. And then you can also cover different types of safety concepts. And so this is really nice because now with just one framework, we can describe a family of safety concepts. But this still doesn't answer the first issue that we brought up, which was what are reasonable assumptions to make about how other agents behave? Right, so this is, here is the differential equation again. And we can see that we need to make some assumptions about what the controls that the robot takes, so this capital U, and what control sets that the human takes, which is the capital D, right? So these will represent, these can represent, what are reasonable controls that each agent can take. And it turns out if we assume that both agents can do absolutely anything possible to, so U and D is as large as possible, this actually results in overly conservative safety concepts. And so what you can see on the bottom is just a picture of the, kind of the safety bubble around the red car. And so here, the red car thinks that it is unsafe for the green car to be in the left lane, right? And this is because this bubble is very wide. And we know that this is not true in practice, right? Whenever you're in a car or you're driving, there are cars just right next to you, but you don't freak out. It is okay, right? Because you know that the car next to you is going to, most likely stay in its own lane and not swerve into you. Okay, so here, the question we're trying to ask is, how do we pick reasonable choices for capital U and capital D, right? What are the reasonable control sets that each agent can draw from? Okay, so how do we do this? Perhaps not too surprisingly, we can learn this from data, right? If we have examples of how humans interact and drive, perhaps we can learn from data what this capital U and capital D should be. And so that's precisely what I did in some work last year. So what I'm saying here is that we can learn reasonable controls from human-human interaction data. So at a very high level, what we're trying to do is that, suppose we have some data of states and controls. So for a particular state, we know what a human did. And what we want to do is we want to learn the control set, capital U, that contains this data, right? And so we want to learn a set such that all the data points for that particular state lives inside that set. And note that this is a state-dependent control set. So the shape and size of U depends on the state X, or what situation the human is in. And so the question is, how do we parameterize this set U? And so we make this kind of observation here and say that humans will take controls that keep them safe, right? So that means that if we were to take controls outside of the boundary, this would lead to an undesirable outcome. So maybe another word to say this is, there is a reason why there's a reason why we observe the controls that we do observe, and also a reason why we don't observe the controls that we don't observe, right? Because if the reason we don't see certain certain control actions is because they would lead to a collision in the future. So that means that we want to learn a set U that is as tight as possible around the data points, right? So inside the set is safe and outside the set is unsafe. So again, without going to all the details, what this insight kind of amounts to is that it is saying that the controls, or the data that we have, lives inside a control invariant set. And so what we have to do now is learn a control invariant set. And I think in the previous talk, you might have learned about this idea of a control barrier function. And a control barrier function is a way to describe control invariant sets. So I'm just, in the interest of time, I'm going to speed up a little bit, but what we have here is a control barrier function, B, that needs to satisfy certain equations for it to be a control invariant set. And then what we can do is, using data, we can learn parameters of this control barrier function such that all the data points satisfy this equation here. And then if we can have a control barrier function, then what will happen is that we automatically can get a state-dependent set. So for a particular X, we can now get a set of controls that is inside this control invariant set. So this is exactly what we wanted, right? We wanted to find a control set U that depended on X, and that would explain the data set that we observe. Okay, so if we do this, we can actually then use the control sets U and also D that we learned from data and plug it back into this H-J reachability partial differential equation. And so what I've written here is a simplification of what happens. It actually becomes a little more complex, but I won't go into that detail. But the point is we can solve this new version of this reachability problem, and hopefully get a safety concept that is more reflective of how people behave in the real world, and hopefully that these safety concepts is less conservative. And so we use training data from actually some previous work, my first paper from grad school, and we have this data set of 2 cars performing a traffic weaving maneuver. So you have 2 cars initially side by side that must swap lanes in a short amount of time. And then what you can see on the right is the different safety concepts or the different safety bubbles that we get by using different assumptions about other agents. So in the red is what you see is the safety concept that we get if we assume both cars are braking. And you can see that this results in this long set that's really skinny. And so because it's not assuming that other cars will steer and turn into the vehicle. The gray or the black shape, that is, you can see that it is really wide, right? It is so wide that it thinks it is unsafe for another vehicle to be in the next lane from the blue car. And we know that this is not true in real life. But this black or gray set is computed by assuming making worst case assumptions about other agents. But then you can see in the green is what we just did where we learned these control sets from data and then plug this back into the reachability formulation. And we can see that the set we get is, it's less wide. It still has a bit of width because cars can steer, can turn left or right, but it is a little bit more, I would say, reflective of how we drive, we drive on the real world, where if a car does get a little too close to us, we do think it's unsafe, but you can see that the green shape is not as wide as the black shape. Cool. So so what we have here is so what this work I've been showing right now is really just focused on a 2-agent setting, which, obviously in the real world, there are more than 2 agents interacting at any time. And so there was also some, I wanted to kind of quickly talk about some recent work that extends some of these ideas to a multi-agent scenario. And the idea here is that, at least in driving, when there are multiple cars on the road, not everyone is equally responsible for ensuring safety for others, right? Depending on where you are, what the road geometry is, and how other vehicles are behaving, you may be less or more responsible for slowing down to avoid collision for other people, for example. And so what we try to do is to learn, what is this responsibility allocation for different agents in the scene? And we're still using this control barrier function formulation, but what we're learning is this additional parameter, which we call the responsibility allocation function, which makes it easier or harder for agents to satisfy this equation. And whether it is easier or harder to satisfy it corresponds to how more or less responsible they are for ensuring safety for others. So again, we use data to learn what this function gamma should be. And then again, without going to the details, I'm just going to skip to the results here and show that, when we do learn this gamma, we're able to, put on our detective hat and do some forensic analysis to try and reason about who may be at fault if a collision were to occur. So what you can see on the left is a situation where a collision does occur between this purple and orange car. And so the question was, who could, who was at fault, or who did something that they shouldn't have done? And then using this, the responsibility allocation function, we were able to see that early on, the orange car actually pulled out in front of the purple car, and they shouldn't have done that. They should have waited, because what they did was, according to our function, it's irresponsible. But then later on, once the orange car got in front of the purple car should have slowed down, but it didn't. So at that point, the purple car was irresponsible. And so this is just a really nice framework or approach to try and reason about, responsibility for multi-agent interaction. Okay, so what I've really talked about was just the surface of this idea of safety and how should we reason about safety for multi-agent interactions. And there are many challenges that exist, and I have, and I'm currently looking into, but this ranges all the way from data collection, right? Having really good interaction data, because even though we have a lot of data available, a lot of it's not really interesting because they're not safety critical. And then there's the question of how do we actually test this in closed loop settings, and then also scaling this to multiple agents. Okay, so I'm going to speed on and go to the second part of my talk. So we have the second part is about interaction-aware planning. So the question here we want to address is, how do we make interactions natural and seamless without explicit communication? So here is a picture of the famous crossing in Tokyo, and it is actually quite remarkable how even though there are so many people and this is a really crowded environment, it is remarkable how people are able to avoid each other without colliding. Right? So what is our secret? How is it possible that we are able to navigate through this crowd, or humans are able to navigate through such crowded environments without collision? And I think there could be many reasons, but one of them is that humans are self-preserving, so that meaning that we don't actually want to collide into each other, and because of this, we will engage in joint collision avoidance. So we will actually try to work together and avoid collision with each other. And so given this, we wanted to ask the question, can we achieve safe and fluid human-robot interactions by leveraging the fact that humans are self-preserving? Right? And so this is kind of highlighting the notion of human-centric autonomy, right? Rather than treating humans as adversaries and making worst-case assumptions about them, can we relax this assumption and kind of move to a mindset where we kind of start off knowing and assuming that humans will work together to avoid collision with the robot. And then in this work that I'm going to talk about, we showed that this can be actually achieved through some very, very simple changes to a general trajectory optimization problem. And I'll explain a little bit more what trajectory optimization is. So trajectory optimization, you could quite literally, as the term suggests, we are optimizing for a trajectory for your robot to execute. And this has many use cases in many domains. So we can use trajectory optimization to come up with a sequence of control actions for a car doing some aggressive off-road driving. This has been done for robot navigation in crowds. Trajectory optimization has been done to land rockets. SpaceX uses it to land their rockets. And this can be also done to control quadrotors in cluttered environments. So basically, trajectory optimization is a way to compute optimal trajectories that help your robot achieve some desired goal position or goal state, subject to dynamic constraints and other constraints as well. Okay, so kind of this work is motivated by two key observations. The first is that humans will cooperate if told how. So the idea is that if you are approaching someone, say in a corridor, if you were somehow told that the person that's approaching you is going to move to the left, then you would also then there, because you want to avoid collision, will also move to the left so you can pass each other without doing that awkward shuffling. Right? So if you knew how to avoid other people, then you probably will do it because this will benefit you at the end. And so kind of with this observation, what we want to do for our robot is that we want to make sure that the robot is moving in a legible way. So basically, motion that conveys intent, right? So if the robot is moving legibly, then this can communicate to humans observing the robot how they should avoid collision with the robot, right? The second is proactivity. So if the robot is proactive in how it is moving, so meaning that it will start, moving to the side to avoid someone earlier on, then this will provide opportunity for a human interacting with the robot to also cooperate and move to the other side accordingly. Right. So basically, we want our robots to move in a legible way and also be proactive in its motions. So how do we actually encode these properties into a robot planning algorithm? So that's something we're going to touch on. The second observation, that we use here is that humans are not completely selfless, meaning that okay, so even if you told me how to avoid collision with other people, I'm not going to completely sacrifice my performance just to help other people, right? I mean, I don't view myself as a selfish person, but I also don't view myself as a completely selfless person either. So basically, and another way to say this is to say, I'm not going to stand in the corner of the room and let everyone pass through before I move on, right? Like I also have places to go and things to do. So so the observation here is that humans are not completely selfless, and they still have some goal or task that they want to achieve in a reasonable amount of time and effort. And so what this means is that we can kind of introduce this notion of inconvenience. So what inconvenience here means is that we can measure the sacrifice an agent has made from some ideal situation. And we want to make sure that this inconvenience is constrained or is within a budget, right? So it is okay for people or for your robot to be slightly inconvenienced as long as it's not inconvenienced too much. Right, so the question then is, how do we limit the amount of inconvenience that an individual, whether this be a human or a robot, experiences? Okay, so with those two kind of observations in mind, what we can do is make some small modifications to a general trajectory optimization problem. So what we see here on the screen is a very general trajectory optimization formulation. So what we're doing is we're trying to select a trajectory that minimizes some objective here. So some objective that is representing some desired behavior. But there are constraints, right? So your robot must satisfy some dynamics. So your robot cannot teleport. So it is, at the end of the day, governed by some physical, ordinary differential equation. And it also might need to avoid obstacles, other agents, and have some limits on what control actions it can take, right? So your system cannot accelerate, at 100 meters per second squared, for example. So anyway, so this is a general trajectory optimization problem. And then what we do in this work is to introduce this thing called a markup factor, and that's what you see in green. And I'm going to talk more about that later, but just by adding this coefficient here, we're actually able to get these really nice emergent behaviors. And then we also add an extra constraint to our problem. So here we want to limit or constrain how much inconvenience our system can experience. And then because we added an extra constraint, we also need to change our problem a little bit to make sure that this remains feasible. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about this markup factor. So what we do is we can choose this number mu to be greater than 1. And so what this ends up doing is that it will penalize the robot for taking controls later in time. So basically, this is discouraging your robot from procrastinating, right? Because the longer it puts off doing something, the more expensive it becomes. And so this allows us to make our robot be more proactive, right? Meaning that if it wants to move to the side to avoid an obstacle, it should move to the side earlier rather than moving to the side at the last second. And so here, let's just to kind of illustrate this a little bit more. Imagine we have a human and a robot that is approaching each other in a head-on scenario. So similar to you trying to pass another person in a narrow corridor. And what we see on the right here is the rotation speed of the robot as we change different values of mu. So we can see that if we choose mu to be greater than 1, the speed and the speed of the rotation is much higher versus if we chose mu to be 0.9, so less than 1, so a robot that is encouraged to procrastinate, we can see that the turning happens a little later and is way less. And this is shown in the orange. Right, so we can see that just by changing this parameter mu, we're able to encourage the robot to make faster and earlier rotations to pass the human. And additionally, we see that so this plot here is showing the heading, and we see that again by changing this mu, we're able to encourage the robot to rotate earlier and more confidently than if we had mu equal to 1. So when we have mu equal to 1, this causes the robot to oscillate back and forth. So it becomes very indecisive, like it goes left and right and left and right. And then sometimes it passes to the left of the human and sometimes it passes to the right of the human. And so by adding this mu greater than 1, this encourages earlier and more confident rotations for the robot. And so basically what we're saying here is that we are able to achieve more legible and more proactive behaviors just by adding this mu coefficient in our cost. Okay, now to the second part, inconvenience. So inconvenience is the cost incurred compared to the ideal trajectory. So the ideal trajectory is a trajectory that the robot would take if no one else was in the environment, but obviously someone's in the way, and so it takes a different trajectory. And we want to measure how much the cost changes between those two trajectories, and the difference in those costs is what we call the inconvenience term. And your cost here can encode things like distance to goal, the amount of acceleration it has over the trajectory, or the total distance traveled. Okay, so again, without going to all the details, I just wanted to quickly highlight the emergent behaviors that we get from this framework that we're proposing. So what you see on the right is our method. And this is, again, a head-on scenario where you have a human and a robot that's approaching each other and they need to pass each other. But you can see on the right, our approach is the trajectories are very smooth. They're very, and it's very fair, meaning that both the human and the robot deviate away by the same amount, right? So no one is sacrificing more than the other. But you can see on all the other baselines, and I won't go into details on what those are, but in all those baselines, they are either indecisive, so there's a lot of wiggling back and forth, you can see here. The robot or the human deviates more than the robot, as you can see in these two, or the robot is a little too aggressive and doesn't turn in time and cause the human to deviate a lot, or the robot is too timid and kind of freezes on the spot and freaks out and causing the human to do all the work to avoid collision. And then we also implemented this approach in real time where we got a human on a Xbox controller controlling this human agent shown in red. And then we have the robot shown in the yellow here that needs to move around the human. And then we can see that early on, the robot actually starts turning to the side to indicate its intent. And because of that, the human knew exactly which way to turn to avoid the robot. So I'm going to speed up a bit. I know I'm running out of time. So just to kind of, again, just summarize the results here, we looked at the performance of our method and compared it to the other baseline methods. And we see that in our method, we don't always do the best in performance, right? Where you can see that on the left here in the blue, these numbers are much lower. But what we do achieve is that we are kind of still on the lower end compared to the other methods, but both the human and the robot share similar values, right? Their total acceleration and this total path of regularity index metric, both the human and the robot experience the same amount, meaning that the experience or the performance that they experience is more balanced. And this is what I refer to as pro-social, right? And pro-social here means behavior that benefits the group, right? So both the human and the robot, they're kind of sacrificing the same amount, that one is not being more selfish than the other. And then we also see that in our method, we actually maintain safety as well compared to other methods. And then for this framework we described, we're able to also extend this to multiple agents and account for wall constraints, as you can see on the right. And so this could be used for indoor settings where there are walls that you want your robot to avoid hitting. And then just in my last slide, I guess my second to last slide, this is some recent work I have on using diffusion models to help robots navigate in crowded environments. And then, so what you can see here is on the left is we're proposing a diffusion-based planner that's able to take into account other agents and kind of smoothly reach the goal. And then on the right is another baseline where you apply a safety filter, and you can see that the robot kind of gets bullied by the other agents. It freaks out a little bit, realizes that it's really far from the goal, and then just kind of plows through the other agents to reach the goal. So we can see that using our diffusion model, we're able to, get these nicer, safer, and more performant behaviors. Okay, so I think I might just leave it at that. And then, so I want to make sure we have time for questions. But again, I just want to end with saying that, I've only just touched the surface on all the problems all the research problems that, I'm really interested in. And there's a lot more that I want to explore. And this ranges from generative modeling to data-driven safety, and then using natural language or LLMs for task specifications. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and thank you everyone for your attention.
All right, so we're going to start with questions. Anybody who has some questions, please, if you can walk over here so they can, ask questions.
Um, well, I'll start. So I'm Leo. I'm from Brazil. I'm working with Professor Andrea Baiti here this summer, and I was thinking about I think this idea of using data to kind of infer the control set, like the human action, like in for safety filters, is very exciting because of like how it showed improves performance. But I was like, it reminded me of a tweet actually by Andrei Karpathy. He said like most data sets are normal distributed, whereas the ideal data set would be uniform distributed because you want to give as much weight to these edge cases as you give to the average case, right? And these normal distributed data sets are good because you can optimize for the average in this case, because you can optimize for the average action and therefore increase performance. But I was wondering how it affects like the safety in the end, because like you miss those like long tail actions. There are usually like these exceptions. There are usually what makes things hard. And I'm sorry for the very long question, but uh,
No,
yeah. So
that's good.
basically, is there like any? I mean, like, have you done any kind of more formal analysis in this sense?
So that is a great question, and something I'm also, thinking about and finding ways to address it. Right? So, what you're saying is, um, you know, especially when it comes to safety, you want to make sure that your data has really good coverage.
Yes.
But I want to say, not only do you want good coverage, you actually really want data that is pretty much on the cusp between safe and unsafe, right? Like if you had a data point that was extremely safe, I would say that's really boring, right? Because you just like, oh, this is safe. There's nothing. Maybe this doesn't give you a lot of signal as to what could have happened to make it unsafe, right? So, because what we're really interested in terms of the safety concept is understanding that boundary between safe and unsafe. And so we really want data that really lies on that boundary to understand that boundary and characterize that boundary. Because right now we don't know where that boundary is. And so, yeah, collecting a data set is actually a challenge in itself. And so you can't really rely on naturalistic data. So just data of, for example, cars just driving normally on the road, because actually turns out a lot of driving is very boring because nothing interesting happens. And so I would say that there are people who are thinking about labeling these data. So like, here's a scenario: can a human come in and just say this is safe or unsafe, or this is really ambiguous here, and kind of label data sets that way. This can be expensive, but then we could maybe look into some auto labeling methods. Other things might be literally, and this will be expensive and difficult to scale, but just getting people in simulators and collecting very specific data sets. But hopefully by doing that, you can build an initial model and then use that model to label other data sets as well.
Okay. So like, okay, got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Killian. I just want to thank you for your presentation. I actually really liked how you pretty much walked through the entire undergraduate journey and how you got to where you are today. And I was curious, how was your experience going about coming from Sydney to research in America and then eventually working as a research scientist and now as a professor? How did you decide what your trajectory should, or what did you decide you want to be a professor versus you want to be a research scientist, or exactly what do you want to research in?
Yeah, so I would say, so I was in Sydney, and then I did a study abroad. So that was really my study abroad in the US. So that was my first exposure to the US. But I actually didn't do any research during my study abroad. I actually back then was like didn't really understand research. I mean, I did this research summer research scholarship before, but that was like my first experience, and it was still kind of figuring it out. But I would say, you know, one of the things that kind of motivated or kind of initiated my, you know, or kind of instigated me applying to grad school in the US was that actually there wasn't a huge aerospace kind of industry in Australia, and a lot of the aerospace activity was in the US. But then that kind of led into more robotics and human-robot interaction to what I'm working on today. But I would say something that I really enjoyed doing throughout my undergrad was teaching and tutoring. I did a lot of tutoring. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed and looked up to my instructors. And I thought, especially the people who taught math, my linear algebra, my calculus professors, they were amazing. And I always just looked up to them, and I was like, wow, like, I wish I could do what they do. And so in the back of my mind, I was like, oh, maybe I want to be a professor. That would be kind of an interesting path. But yeah, I just kind of, I would say a lot of times the opportunity arose, or kind of just stumbled into that opportunity and found out that I really enjoyed doing that, and decided to, you know, follow that direction. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. My question is kind of long, so please bear with me. So it's kind of less about like safety and control and more about like navigating diverse environments. What comes to mind is, for example, domestic environments. So there have been like a few approaches that try to build the robotics framework like human episodic memory is like built. So basically that the robot doesn't have to go through like tons of training, but basically has some kind of one-shot learning capabilities so that it can like learn from its own experiences. I was wondering if you have any opinions on that, if you think that is like a feasible approach or anything.
Like having your robot like learn online, like as it experiences and interacts with the world, it's building its memory.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it is important for your robots to be able to adapt and learn and adjust its behaviors to real world, to kind of new experiences. Because a lot of the times your robot will experience situations that are out of distribution, or you know, be in a completely new environment it has never seen before. But if it's able to continually kind of collect these memories or experiences and store them, and continually build its kind of database, if you will, then it's able to slowly expand the envelope that it can operate in. How to do this efficiently, I don't know if I have a good answer, but I think there's been a lot of work on, say, like latent space learning to say, well, how do you tell that this new scenario is similar or different than something you have seen before, and how similar or how different it is? Because if you can then say, oh, it is too different from what I have seen before, then you want to flag it as a completely new experience and store it somewhere safe or store it somewhere. But if you can say, oh, this is actually very similar to what I've already seen, then maybe you don't need to keep that fresh, or keep that memory fresh, because you already have a lot of, you know, examples in your database. So there could be some things there to explore.
So kind of like the more frequent the experience, the more like kind of important it is, or
so I don't know. I would say if you experience something regularly, then I feel like that might be, you store that somewhere differently in your brain. But if you then experience something that's very different, or, you know, one-off, you know, as humans, you kind of store that memory elsewhere. And so maybe there's some, connection or kind of analogies there for a robot.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Thank you for your talk today. My name's Gabe, and I had a question on the last later bit of your presentation. So I saw the robot car driver signaled its intent through the use of an arrow indicator, which helped a human navigate around it, preventing a collision. And I wanted to ask, like, what kind of systems can we design in the real world to also allow robots to signal their intent?
So you're talking about like in driving, you have your indicator, and that just by seeing that turn on or off, like you clearly know what that car is going to do. So I would say yes, like if you could put massive computer screens on all your robots and that would just say, hey, like this is what the robot's doing, that would be amazing. But there are obviously practical limitations to that. But I would say even for just us driving on the road today, like there are many instances where people don't use their indicators, or the indicators are on and they just kind of forgot about it and not actually do what the indicator says. So I would say they are also very noisy. And so there's that. I would say there are, and so, I was on the second half of my talk, I was talking about legibility and proactivity. And so if robots are able to move in a way that seems a bit more confident or more deliberate, then it will be easier for humans to predict what they're doing and plan accordingly, right? Like even when you're walking in a crowd, if you're, walking a zigzag way, then this will confuse a lot of people around you, and that might actually lead to a collision more frequently than if you were to just walk straight and fast, right? If you just walk straight and fast, it looks like it's very clear where you're heading. Even though you're moving faster and that might seem more unsafe, actually it could actually be more safe if you walk straight as opposed to slow and zigzaggy. But I also want to shout out to people doing research in augmented reality. I think there's a lot of interest and research on how we can use AR to augment our senses, and hopefully this can then provide us with more signals that will let us humans know what the robots are doing. But there's still a few technical and practical challenges before we get there. But I would say people are really excited about kind of AR technologies.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have one more question, and this one's actually from YouTube.
Okay.
Could you please elaborate a bit more on how IBR is used in legible and proactive framework? How is the behavior of the human modeled in this case?
Oh, that's a good question. So yeah, this was a detail that I skipped in the second half of my talk. So I was talking. In the second half of my talk, I was talking about trajectory optimization and how we formulated it. But what we actually did in the experiments to account for the reactions of the human, right? Because in an interactive scenario, what the human does will affect what the robot does, and what the robot does will affect what the human does. And so we solve this using something known as an iterated best response. And so we modeled the human, actually in this case, similarly. So they were also solving a trajectory optimization problem. But in our experiments, the robot didn't have access to, well, the robot assumed some parameters for the human, but the human was actually behaving differently than what the robot assumed. But because we were replanning at every time step, the robot was actually able to adjust its behaviors despite not having perfect knowledge about how the human was actually behaving. So hopefully that answers your question.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for talking with us. It was really, really good to have you here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I had some great questions, and well, yeah, I guess I didn't show my last slide, but please feel free to reach out if you have any more questions or want to chat about anything. I'm happy to do it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Trustworthy autonomous systems that operate seamlessly with alongside